I grew up in a Milwaukee family that knew what permissive meant before anybody ever heard the word. A dozen adults of the family and only 2 children, my younger brother Bob and myself. Now, my dad had often taken us along on his calls at building construction projects. He would tell us to follow him as he walked across the high boards and roof beams, and well, I was always frightened, but I never could bring myself to admit it, so I just did as he told me. And I thought he'd never notice until one day he said to me, "You won't fall, I promise, if you don't look down. Just look ahead." Dickie Chappelle was an unsung American hero. As one of the first women to photograph and report from the front lines, her fearless determination to get the perfect shot blazed the trail for women in every area of journalism. She documented stunning victories, heartwarming relief efforts, and devastating losses. But as she distantly viewed the struggles of the world through the lens of a camera, her own struggles became too real to avoid with a flashbulb and a typewriter. But through her extreme dedication to her work, Dickie shows us that by pursuing our passions, we can learn to give grief a new name: inspiration. What's a Woman Doing Here? By Dickie Chappelle. Tony Chappelle directed the making of TWA's publicity pictures. He had been one of the first Navy photographers in World War I, and that made him at least 40. But he had the most cheerful disposition of anyone I had ever known, except, of course, when he was initiating tyros into the one matter on earth he held utterly sacred: photography. Well, I was awestruck by Tony. I learned my lessons bone deep as quickly as I could. I don't think I've ever forgotten any one of them. Because, you see, if a picture was a failure, no alibi would placate Tony. If your equipment failed, it was because you hadn't taken proper care of it. If you weren't in the right position to shoot, it was because you were too lazy to have climbed up where you should have been. And if your nerve failed. But then, I'd been a photographer for 10 years before I'd ever heard one admit he'd been too shaken to shoot. No alibi. Just look ahead. Well, my course in picture taking did not end the first time I produced an acceptable photo. In October of 1940, the teacher and I went out to Milwaukee and we were married. Now, our first home was a hotel suite with a kitchenette big enough to serve as our joint darkroom. You see, by now I was a dedicated photographer, and my career would be telling stories through pictures alone. And for 6 years, Tony and I served as a photographing and reporting team for a dozen humanitarian agencies. You see, we all wanted to remind people what havoc the war left, what terrible problems remained. But the workday pictures we'd been creating in New York seemed often to further this illusion of global peace. Or the post-war time overseas. I remember it now as a kaleidoscope of people, unfading, the way they looked and sounded vivid as yesterday. The wreckage resulting from man's inhumanity to man was the litany I wrote and the subject I photographed. And the magnitude of relief devised, it never quite matched the magnitude of suffering caused. And Tony's and my work as a photo team did end. And soon after we came to what I guess is called the parting of the ways, both personally and professionally. We were separated in 1955 and our marriage dissolved the following summer. And several times interviewers have asked me this same question about marriage. They say, can a woman be both a foreign correspondent and a wife? Well, I guess my answer is never at the same time. And I just can't make the reason sound sentimental, although I'm sure it has to do with the heart and not the head. It's a 24-hour-a-day task till the story's done, and once you start, you can't know where it will lead you. till it's done. People you love always receive less evidence of love than the correspondent wants to give them. My mother always said that human problems are solved by loving more, and in no other way, which I'm sure is correct. And some marriages survive this deprivation indefinitely, but mine did not. I'd been a photographer for 10 years before I'd ever heard one admit he'd been too shaken to shoot. Because you see, the thing about photography is there is never an alibi. There is no alibi. No alibi if your nerve fails. No alibi if your equipment fails. No alibi if you aren't in the right position to shoot. No alibi if your picture is a complete failure. Or your marriage. I'm sorry. Well, Tony taught us how to use the heavy speed graphic, the camera newspapermen still carry in the movies. It's so big that snap shooting, taking a picture casually, it can't be done with it. You have to plan the picture in your mind's eye and move to the vantage point before you raise the camera. You see, this was the most important lesson Tony wanted us to learn. Just look ahead.